This is Dr. June from Premium Pro Nutraceuticals, and in this video I will be reviewing the book Fat Chance by Dr. Robert Lustig to answer the question of why sugar and processed food make you fat and sick. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the book, then I will uncover the structure of the book and analyze the key contents, and followed by a fair criticism of the book from a holistic doctor's perspective. Fat Chance was written in 2012, so as of this recording, more than a decade has passed since then. It conveys scientific and medical knowledge and is a practical book as it offers concrete advice for readers and public health intervention. So let's go right into the overview. About the author. Robert H. Lustig is an internationally renowned pediatric endocrinologist who has spent the past 16 years treating childhood obesity and studying the effects of sugar on the central nervous system, metabolism, and disease. He is the director of the Weight Assessment for Teen and Child Health Program at University of California, San Francisco Children's Hospital, a member of the UCSF Center for Obesity Assessment, Study, and Treatment, as well as a member of the Obesity Task Force of the Endocrine Society. So one of the main themes of the book is that sugar is a ubiquitous toxin, and it is a primary driver of obesity and chronic metabolic disease worldwide. And Dr. Lustig systematically dismantles the conventional wisdom that obesity is due to quote-unquote gluttony and sloth. He's challenging the misconception that you're fat because you stuff yourself and you're a couch potato. He's also going to challenge the view that a calorie is a calorie. Dr. Lustig also seeks to prove that obesity is a hormonal problem driven by the environment rather than a result of personal behavioral failures. And he ultimately quotes that obesity does not kill, metabolic syndrome kills. So it's not the excess body fat that kills, but the internal complications and disharmony that happens at an organ level that destroys you. So metabolic syndrome can happen regardless of your body weight. So if you are an obese, overweight person thinking your life is doomed, that is not your fate as long as you don't surrender to that belief. So now we move on to the problems that Dr. Lustig attempts to solve in this book. First is a scientific problem, that is determining the metabolic, hormonal, and environmental causes of global obesity pandemic. The next up is the philosophical problem of overturning the myth of personal responsibility by proving that biochemistry dictates behavior. And then he attempts to solve the practical problem of providing effective science-based antidotes for individual health. And last but not least, the societal problem of outlining the necessary policy and regulatory interventions required to address the political and commercial forces driving this obesity pandemic. And we don't realize that obesity is also a pandemic. We're familiar with what has happened in 2020, but obesity has been a pandemic for far longer. So now let's go right into the book structure. The book is organized into 6 major parts. So first part is the greatest story ever sold. So this part challenges the traditional dogma of obesity being caused by energy imbalance alone and introduces the idea that a calorie is not a calorie. If you're still a little confused by this, don't worry, I'll get to that in the next section where I break down the key terms. Part 2 goes on to talking about to eat or not to eat. That's not the question. It focuses on the science of behavior, arguing that gluttony and sloth are behaviors driven by hormones. Part 3 is chewing the fat. So it dives into the science of fat storage and differentiating between different types of fat. So there is a harmless subcutaneous fat, what Dr. Lustig calls it the big butt fat, and dangerous visceral fat, that's the belly fat and the fat that accumulates inside of your organs. And this part also details metabolic syndrome as the real cause of death. In part 4, the real toxic environment gets to the crux of the book, where it discusses fructose as the toxin, the main culprit, and then comes up with fiber and exercise as 2 solutions to overcome obesity and metabolic syndrome. Part 5 is a personal solution, outlines steps that you can take to alter your food and hormonal environment. And then the last part is a public health solution, which calls for governmental and societal action, arguing that government has been co-opted by the food industry and must enforce global sugar reduction. Alright, so now it's time for content analysis. I'm going to go over key terms that the book lays out, as well as the key arguments and whether the book successfully addresses the problems that it attempted to solve. So for the key terms, I've got calories not a calorie, fructose, hyperinsulinemia, leptin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and visceral fat. So a calorie is not a calorie. This is a foundational concept that the body processes calories differently depending on their source, whether it's protein, fat, glucose, or fructose, and determines whether energy is burned or stored. So this ultimately affects the caloric output. And next up is fructose, and this is the sugar that Dr. Lustig identifies as the primary villain when it comes to obesity. And he makes a clear distinction that fructose in this case is talking about sweet molecule and sugar, sugar being sucrose and high fructose corn syrup. And this molecule in sugar is metabolized like fat in the liver. So because it is broken down like fat, it bypasses insulin regulation. Insulin is not activated in this sense when fructose is being broken down in the liver. And this process directly leads to fat buildup in the liver. Hyperinsulinemia is a condition of chronically elevated insulin. And insulin, Dr. Lustig categorizes it as the energy storage hormone. And insulin is the bad guy in Dr. Lustig's book because of the fact that the more insulin the body produces, high levels of insulin, essentially means that energy is redirected into fat cells and contributes to the growth of fat cells. And chronically high insulin also leads to leptin resistance, which is when the brain believes the body is starving because it cannot detect the leptin. Leptin is a satiety hormone that tells your body that you're full to not eat anymore. And so leptin resistance is driven by high levels of insulin. And so that's the reason why Dr. Lustig identifies insulin as the bad guy in obesity, and rightfully so, because insulin contributes to gluttony and sloth by making you eat more, and because it encourages over storage of energy in fat cells, it makes your body passive and inactive in terms of metabolism. So metabolic syndrome is a very important term for you to know because this, Dr. Lustig argues, is the true cause of early death and chronic disease. So obesity is a marker, it's a symptom of the bigger umbrella of metabolic syndrome. Obesity does not cause metabolic syndrome per se, it is a marker of metabolic syndrome. And Dr. Lustig defines metabolic syndrome as a cluster of chronic metabolic diseases characterized by energy overload of the mitochondria. So it's a refreshing perspective. It's not necessarily that your cells are weakened or lacking energy, but rather your cells are overloaded with energy, that it becomes dysfunctional. And last but not least, visceral fat is another key term. This is the metabolically active fat stored around abdominal organs and inside the liver. And this fat, not total body weight, is the key determinant of metabolic syndrome. So being metabolically active means that it is relatively easier for this type of fat to shrink. And subcutaneous fat is relatively passive metabolically, meaning it's hard to get rid of. But with visceral fat, there's plenty you can do to shrink it. So now let's move on to the key arguments that Dr. Lustig makes in this book. First is that fructose is metabolically toxic, and again, when he says fructose, he's specifically referring to sugar, such as sucrose and high fructose corn syrup. Second is biochemistry controls behavior, and he presents reducing insulin as the key solution to reversing your metabolic syndrome and helping you with fat loss. So, fructose is what overloads the liver's energy processing. We talked about the initiating cause of metabolic syndrome being that the mitochondria is overloaded with energy. Well, fructose, once it begins processing in the liver, it overloads the liver's mitochondria. And as fructose gets processed, it generates fat and toxic metabolic byproducts, and this is what begins the metabolic syndrome, such as insulin resistance, inflammation, visceral fat gain, and so on. Another key argument he makes is that biochemistry controls behavior. And he gives an example of how the obesity epidemic affects infants who cannot make behavioral choices on their own. So he proves that the cause is biological rather than behavioral. And he presents clinical examples that show that when high insulin is lowered, the behaviors characterized by gluttony and sloth improve, demonstrating that hormones, specifically insulin, drives the behavior, not vice versa. So insulin is a hormone that responds to rising blood sugar levels. So reducing insulin is the key. The key is a steady blood sugar, and even after a meal, you don't want your blood sugar to spike. You want a steady rise and a steady decrease in insulin. And the way to do that is to reduce sugar and refined carbs. So reducing sugar means you are reducing fructose. So you're limiting the liver fat production as well as toxic metabolites. And you're also cutting back on refined carbs, which have glucose. So glucose is what stimulates the initial insulin release. So cutting back on the refined carbs reduces or limits the insulin release after a meal or after eating. And Dr. Lustig advocates increasing fiber, both soluble and insoluble. And this is what slows the absorption of sugars and fat as it gets digested in your gut. So this slower absorption of glucose, sugars, is what's going to ultimately balance out the release of insulin. And the way fiber does that in your gut is by creating a barrier in the intestine. And the other half of the antidote, he provides exercising. Now, exercise alone does not cause significant weight loss. He admits that. But it helps improve the insulin sensitivity, builds muscle mass, which burns energy instead of storing it, and reduces visceral fat. So what does this book ultimately solve, and what remains unsolved? That's what we're going to uncover in this section here. So the book successfully solves the problem of identifying the biological cause of obesity, and Dr. Lustig has developed a clear evidence-based model that explains how the modern diet leads to disease, and also he's identified mechanism for improving metabolic health, and that is to reduce insulin. Now, the problem of implementation at the individual level and societal level remains largely unsolved. Now, even with full commitment to environmental change, individually, your genetic, developmental, or hormonal factors may be overwhelming. And for those individuals, Dr. Lustig requires last resorts like surgery or medications. But he does clarify that that is a very small group of individuals, about 20 to 30% of the obese population. And there are positive ways to influence your genetics, aka epigenetics. There are positive ways to influence your hormone signaling, and there are positive ways to influence your behaviors to ensure that you can maximize the chance of overcoming obesity and metabolic syndrome by following the antidotes that Dr. Lustig presents in the book. Now, at the societal level, Dr. Lustig argues that the government is actively fostering this obesity epidemic through subsidies and resistance to necessary regulations, like classifying sugar as a toxin. And because of this lopsided political power structure, reversing the pandemic is hindered, and solving the problem of obesity, requires a bottom-up movement rather than relying on the government. Ultimately, it's up to us. It's ultimately up to the individuals to be educated, be enlightened, and be empowered with the necessary tools and knowledge to overcome the health barriers, reclaim your wellness, and to sustain it for the rest of your life. Now it comes down to the fair criticism of the book, and it really just comes down to two things. One is intense focus on fructose as the primary villain, and the other one being gap between diagnosis and implementation. So when it comes to presenting fructose as the primary villain, he does mention other environmental factors like obesogens, which are chemicals that contribute to weight gain, sleep debt, and cortisol. Now, he dedicates the vast majority of the book to the sugar mechanism. So, a fair criticism would be that this intense focus might reduce the completeness of the analysis by downplaying the synergistic role these other modern environmental inputs play in driving hyperinsulinemia, in driving the insulin levels and fat accumulation in the body. So the book is indeed digestible because it simplifies this core message focused on fructose. There are many different variables that you need to consider that all tie into this cause of obesity. And then the gap between diagnosis and implementation. This goes back to the previous problem that remains unsolved, mainly in the political level, because major political changes are really not happening. And so the book concludes in a pessimistic tone that highlights its own incompleteness. Dr. Lustig understands that regarding the practical political solution, because he identifies that the system is fundamentally broken and government is actively preventing change. The analysis provides an excellent diagnosis and clear prescription, but fails to solve the most pressing societal problem it set out to address, and that is how to overcome the forces preventing policy change before medical and financial Armageddon occurs. It does seem overwhelming to know that there really isn't much that you can do as an individual to radically transform the food industry, but there are very good alternatives. People are waking up and taking responsibility for their own health, and there are professionals, doctors, healthcare practitioners that are guiding people. So to kickstart your journey, learn more about my weight loss program designed to integrate Dr. Lustig's solution to your everyday routine. It focuses on healing your body at a cellular level, restoring your hormonal health and metabolism. So I'll leave the link to the program details in the description and in the comments below for you to check it out. This concludes the book review of Dr. Lustig's Fat Chance. Bye for now.